Good evening. Tonight, we embark on a journey, not to a distant land, but to a different time. We're going to step into the quietest, most vulnerable moments of our ancestors' lives, into the very heart of their nights. We begin with something we all share, something so universal we rarely stop to think about it: sleep. But as you're about to discover, the way people slept in the medieval world was stranger, more spiritual, and far more precarious than anything we can imagine today. So find a comfortable place, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum that blurs the edges of the world. Let your mind drift as we pull back the curtain of centuries and listen to the whispers of the past. Our journey begins in the deep, profound darkness of the Middle Ages. Part E, The Secret World of Medieval Night. Chapter 1, The Two Sleeps of Midnight. Imagine a world utterly devoid of the glow of a screen, a world without electricity, without TikTok, without the endless scroll of social media that defines our modern nights. This was the world of medieval Europe. When the sun bled out across the horizon, the darkness that fell wasn't merely an absence of light, it was a presence. It was a thick, living entity that carried the biting cold, the profound silence, and a pantheon of unspoken fears. In this world, the night was not a single, unbroken expanse of rest. It was a journey in two parts. The people of the Middle Ages approached their slumber with a schedule that would utterly baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. They did not chase the elusive 8-hour block of uninterrupted sleep like a sacred prize. Instead, their bodies were tuned to a more ancient, more natural rhythm, something historians now call segmented sleep. It was a sleep cycle, cleaved neatly in two, like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was remarkably consistent across the continent, practiced by the poorest peasants in their wattle, and daub huts, and the most learned monks in their cold stone monasteries. Soon after sundown, as the last vestiges of twilight faded, families would gather, eat a meager meal, and then, with little else to do, they would simply turn in for the night. They drifted off into what they called the first sleep. This initial slumber would last for about 4 hours, a deep, restorative plunge into unconsciousness that allowed their bodies to recover from a day of backbreaking labor in the fields or the forge. But then, somewhere around the stroke of midnight, a strange thing would happen. They would wake up, and this wasn't the fitful, anxiety-ridden awakening of insomnia we know today. This was a deliberate, expected, and even productive part of the night. For the next hour or two, in the pitch-black heart of the night, they would engage in what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This liminal period, this waking intermission between two sleeps, was known as the watch. It wasn't a disorder. It was simply how sleep worked. It was a practical, useful, and sometimes alarmingly social time. In the profound stillness of that hour, the world outside was a void, but inside the home, a quiet industry would begin. A scholar might light a precious candle and lean over a manuscript, his mind sharp and clear in the silence. A wife might stoke the dying embers of the hearth, adding another log to fight off the chill that seeped through the walls. A farmer might pull on a rough cloak and step out into the frigid air to check on his livestock, because nothing ruins your REM cycle like the nagging fear that your only goat has wandered off into the woods. People would use this time for quiet reflection, for prayer, for mending clothes or sharpening tools. And yes, according to medieval physicians and marriage manuals, this was also considered the ideal time for marital intimacy. The body was well rested, the mind was calm, which sounds like a very polite way of saying they were both too tired to argue. So, if you ever thought you were being romantic for waking up early to make your partner a cup of coffee, just know that your ancestors were setting the bar very, very differently. After this productive interlude, people would return to their beds for their second sleep, which would last until the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. This two-part rhythm was so commonplace that it was even mentioned casually in literature by authors like Chaucer, implying that it was simply an accepted fact of life. What's fascinating is that modern science has begun to suggest that this segmented sleep pattern might actually be more natural for human beings. Our circadian rhythms, in the absence of artificial light, seemed to favor this two-sleep cycle. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, with its factories that demanded rigid schedules, its gas lamps that pushed back the night, and its growing obsession with productivity, that humanity began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, as if rest itself were a timed sport. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, don't panic. Don't reach for your phone. Just whisper to yourself, "Ah, yes, the watch has begun." In the medieval world, waking up in the dead of night wasn't a failure. It was the schedule. And everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. Chapter 2. The Bed of Survival. Now, let's talk about the bed itself, or rather, the medieval approximation of one. In our modern world, we are obsessed with the architecture of comfort. We debate thread counts, we sink into memory foam, we praise the virtues of cooling gels and cloud-like mattresses. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. For the vast majority of the population, the typical peasant bed was a straw-filled mattress known as a pallet. And that's not a poetic description. It was literally a large sack made of rough, scratchy fabric, stuffed with straw or hay, that is, if you were lucky enough to afford the sack. If not, your bed was simply a pile of loose straw on the cold, damp earth of your cottage floor, a pile possibly already claimed by the family cat or a few enterprising chickens. Comfort was not the objective, survival was. These straw pallets were far from soft, but they were infinitely better than the alternative, which was nothing. Straw was cheap, it was plentiful, and it provided a crucial layer of insulation against the bone-chilling cold that seeped up from the ground. However, it was also a 5-star hotel for insects. Fleas, lice, and the occasional field mouse found a welcoming home in the dense, musty straw, which turned the act of sleeping into an exercise in cautious stillness. If something itched, you ignored it. If something bit you, you shifted your weight slightly and hoped for the best. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a son with a strong back, they might elevate this straw pallet onto a crude wooden frame. This didn't dramatically change the sleep experience, but it did slightly reduce the odds of waking up with beetles in your ear. Fine linens were a fantasy. Most people simply slept in the same clothes they had worn all day. The concept of pajamas wasn't really a thing, and neither, for that matter, was personal space. Entire families, parents, children, and perhaps a grandparent or a visiting cousin all slept together in the same room, often on the very same straw pile. If you got too warm in the night, you could always just roll into your cousin's elbow. Of course, the nobility had proper beds. These were massive, ornate structures with intricately carved wooden frames, mattresses stuffed with soft feathers, embroidered sheets, and heavy canopy curtains to keep out the drafts, and hopefully, some of the lice. These beds were so incredibly valuable that they were considered prized heirlooms, often listed specifically in wills and passed down through generations. You didn't just inherit the castle, you inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. But for most medieval people, a bed wasn't a sanctuary of comfort. It was a functional tool. It was a place to not freeze to death, a place to stay clear of the wandering farm animals, and maybe, just maybe, a place to dream of one day being rich enough to sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. Chapter 3. Nightcaps and Nightmares. When we hear the term nightcap today, we think of a cozy, warming drink before bed. A bit of whiskey, perhaps, by a crackling fire, a prelude to a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was not a beverage. It was a hat, a real, tangible, and often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric, designed for one crucial purpose: to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation was not a strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls held the cold, drafty thatched roofs, let the wind whistle through, and windows, if you had them at all, were made of thin, stretched animal horn or oiled parchment. They did little to keep the elements at bay, and central heating? That was called a dog, or a pig. Since most of your body heat escapes through your scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap as a non-negotiable piece of sleepwear. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version is the one we see in illustrations. Long, pointed, and floppy, like something you'd expect to see on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warm fabric could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, it was a purely practical accessory. For women, it often doubled as a coif or head wrap, serving the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that probably hadn't seen soap since last Lent. But beyond simple warmth, the nightcap carried social weight. In some regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, even while asleep, as a sign of their marital status. The cap itself could be embroidered or dyed with certain colors to reflect a family's wealth or social standing, because nothing says, "I've made it," like going to bed with what is essentially a tiny, handcrafted flag on your skull. In more urban settings, wearing a nightcap became a clear social signal. If you answered your door wearing one, it was the polite medieval way of saying, "I am not dressed for conversation. Please go away." Quote. Of course, these nightcaps were often paired with long, loose tunics called nightshirts. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge before his ghostly intervention. This sleepwear wasn't designed to be sexy or stylish. It was practical, it was often itchy, and, given the proximity to open flames, it was occasionally flammable. And then there were the creatures of the night you couldn't keep out with a hat. The real monsters of the medieval bedroom were already in the sheets. Small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat this. Hygiene was not medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were a rare luxury, laundry was an expensive and laborious process, and soap was often made from substances better left unnamed. Combine that with straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional chicken sleeping underfoot, and you have created the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically considered roommates. Peasants dealt with their constant itching presence as a fact of life. But even the nobles, with their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some wealthy households employed dedicated nitpickers, actual servants, whose sole job was to painstakingly remove lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that as your job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in the cracks of wooden bed frames, in the seams of mattresses, and even in the crevices of stone walls, emerging in the dead of night to feast like tiny, silent vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval people slept so fully clothed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was a desperate, last-ditch form of pest defense armor. The solutions they devised ranged from the mildly effective to the impressively deranged. Some people burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood to repel the bugs. Others would sleep with garlic, onions, or even ashes sprinkled in their bed, which may have done very little to deter the pests, but certainly kept romance to a minimum. This wasn't just a physical discomfort, it was a moral one. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin and impurity, tiny biting reminders of the fall of man, and of course, poor bedding choices. Poets of the era even wrote odes to fleas, some moralizing, some weirdly romantic, because nothing says "I love you" quite like the line, "Let us be united like the flea that bites us both." So while our modern sleep is interrupted by the buzz of a phone or the glow of a streetlight, medieval sleep was far more likely to be disturbed by frantic scratching, involuntary twitching, and the subtle, creeping feeling that something was crawling on your shin, because it was. Chapter 4, the communal bed. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a complete stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, sharing your bed with someone you'd never met before was completely normal and not at all optional. Picture this: you are a traveling merchant, a pilgrim on your way to a holy shrine, or just someone whose mule has given up halfway to Norwich. You finally find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and you ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room, It's not even your own bed. It's not even a particularly clean spot on the floor. What you get is a space in a bed that is already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. The concept of privacy was not just unexpected, it was virtually non-existent. If a bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with 1, 2, or even 3 complete strangers who might snore like a boar, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. This wasn't considered rude or invasive. It was simply the most efficient use of resources. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with long rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged. The battle for elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some innkeepers tried to group guests by profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and allegedly, thieves with other thieves, but often it was simply first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a waking nightmare to the modern germaphobe, back then, it was a significant upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Worried about theft? Most travelers developed strategies. Many slept with their purse tied securely to their belt or hidden deep within their clothes. Others slept directly on top of their bundles of goods, turning their luggage into a combination pillow and early warning alarm system. If someone tried to move your bag in the middle of the night, it usually meant you were about to wake up significantly poorer. The wealthy, of course, did not have to suffer this fate. Nobles traveled with their own entourage and either camped in relative comfort or simply demanded their own private rooms, an order an innkeeper was wise to obey if they valued their roof. But this culture of co-sleeping wasn't just for travelers. Even at home, sleeping alone was considered strange, impractical, and downright unsafe. First, there was the simple matter of warmth. With no central heating, people huddled together for shared body heat, not out of intimacy, but out of basic thermal desperation. Children slept with their siblings, their parents, and sometimes a visiting neighbor's kid if they were staying over. It was like a permanent sleepover, except nobody asked if you wanted to be there. Beyond warmth, however, there was a deeply ingrained spiritual reason for sleeping in groups. The night was believed to be the devil's playground. It was when demons whispered temptations and spirits roamed the earth. To sleep alone was to leave your soul vulnerable, an isolated target in the dark. Having others nearby created a sort of moral buffer zone. If a demon did show up, at least someone else would be there to witness it, or maybe get possessed first. For children, being alone at night was practically unthinkable. The world was filled with tales of ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits who preyed on the solitary. These weren't bedtime stories that ended with a comforting hug. They ended in disappearances. So, the next time you find yourself curled up in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell faintly of goat, take a moment to enjoy the silence and solitude. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and your cousin Gerald in there with you, and all of them would be snoring. Chapter 5. The Spirituality of Sleep. For the people of the Middle Ages, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were nothing less than your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. This is why bedtime prayers were not just a comforting ritual, they were a critical necessity. Forget lavender pillow spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down their day with confessions, psalms, and a thorough spiritual cleansing, just in case they happened to die somewhere between good-night and dawn. The logic was stark and simple. You could die at any moment. From illness, from a house fire, from a demon hiding in the rafters, or, most dangerously, from simply being over the age of 30 in the year 1247. So you had better say your prayers, not because it was soothing, but because hell was a very real and terrifying possibility, and you didn't want to show up at its gates uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. The famous children's prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep," has its roots in this mindset. Think of its older version. "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." It sounds sweet until you realize it's essentially a legal document written by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had an entire catalog of prayers, tailored to specific nightly threats. There was a prayer for when you were feeling particularly guilty, another for when you suspected the devil might be hiding in your wardrobe, and one for plague prevention, which, unfortunately, aged rather poorly. Some people even prayed to specific saints who were known for watching over sleepers, acting as holy bouncers guarding the door to your soul. Dreams, too, were treated with the utmost seriousness. In our modern world, we often dismiss dreams as random neurological nonsense, the result of stress, too much cheese before bed, or just your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were profound. They carried eternal consequences. They weren't just dreams, they were messages. They could be divine revelations from God, warnings from a guardian angel, or cunning temptations sent by the devil. Either way, you were expected to pay attention. You might be required to write your dream down, confess it to a priest, or even fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians and monks spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire books, called dream guides, were written to decode their symbolism. Did you dream of fire? That might be a vision of hell. Did you dream of water? That could mean purification or drowning. Did you dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? You had better call a priest immediately and possibly consider moving. What you did in a dream mattered because it was believed your soul remained active while your body slept. An embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread could be interpreted as your subconscious confessing to the sin of gluttony. Better confess it to the priest anyway, just in case. This nightly spiritual vigilance reached its apex in the monasteries. Monks and nuns followed a rigid schedule of prayers called the canonical hours, and the very first service, matins, took place in the dead of night, often around 2 a.m. A bell would toll, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would shuffle in silence to the cold, dark chapel. There, by the flickering light of a single candle, they would chant psalms and recite scriptures, trying their best not to fall asleep on their feet, a real offense that could be punished with extra chores. It was a profound sacrifice of comfort, meant to dedicate the quietest, darkest part of the night to God, uninterrupted by the temptations of daylight, warmth, or a proper REM cycle. Sleep wasn't rest. It was a battleground for the soul, a nightly ritual of preparation for the ultimate unknown. And every night, as they closed their eyes, the people of the Middle Ages hoped they had done enough to survive until morning. Music shifts, becoming more somber and tense. Narrator. From the private internal fears that haunted the medieval night, we now travel across an ocean and forward in time, to a place where those fears spilled out into the daylight. We journey to a small, isolated village in colonial America, a community so consumed by suspicion and piety that it turned its waking hours into a living nightmare. This is a story not of demons in dreams, but of the devils people create in each other. We are going to Salem. Part 2, The Salem Nightmare. Chapter 6, The Spark in the Winter. In the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was a place cloaked in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension and suspicion, and in a quiet, creeping fear that seeped into the timber-framed homes and froze the barren fields. The people of Salem were Puritans, a community built on a foundation of strict, devout, and deeply superstitious faith. They believed they were carving a holy society out of the wilderness, a city on a hill, constantly watched by God and relentlessly stalked by Satan. Life here was already hanging by a thread. The village had recently endured a bitter split from the more prosperous Salem town over politics and religion, leaving scars of resentment. Recent crops had failed. Smallpox had ravaged nearby communities, a grim reminder of their fragility. Wars with native tribes had left a deep-seated trauma and paranoia about the dark, unknown woods that surrounded them. Within the village itself, there was constant friction, petty squabbles over land, disputes over inheritance, and a profound distrust of anyone who didn't quite fit the rigid Puritan mold. Add to this pressure cooker the long, dark, bitterly cold New England winter, a season that forced everyone indoors into close quarters where anxieties could fester and multiply. Something was bound to break. That break came in the home of the village's own minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris. It began with his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. The girls started to behave in ways that defied all explanation. They would scream uncontrollably for no reason. They threw objects across the room as if moved by an unseen hand. They contorted their bodies into unnatural, painful-looking shapes. At times, they would fall into a silent, catatonic state for hours, their eyes wide with a terror no one else could see. The girls claimed they were being tormented. They spoke of being pinched, bitten, and pricked by invisible forces. Neighbors whispered that the girls were cursed, that an evil hand was at work in the village. Reverend Parris, a man more comfortable with scripture than with crisis, was at a loss. He called in the local doctor, William Griggs, who examined the girls thoroughly. Finding no physical cause for their ailments, Dr. Griggs delivered the one diagnosis that would ignite the entire community like a powder keg: witchcraft. That single, terrifying word gave a name to all the free-floating anxieties that had been poisoning Salem. In a place where witches were believed to be real, tangible servants of the devil, the idea was not just plausible, it was an explanation. And if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, the very spiritual heart of the village, then what did that mean for everyone else? Was anyone safe? Under intense pressure from the adults around them, the afflicted girls began to name names. At first, they pointed to women on the absolute margins of society, the misfits, the beggars, the outcasts. But soon, the accusations would creep inward, reaching for the respectable, the wealthy, and even the most pious members of the church. Salem was a small village, but what was about to happen would echo for centuries. What began as whispers in the dark of a cold winter would soon become the cries of the accused from the gallows, leaving a legacy of paranoia and injustice that still haunts the pages of American history. Chapter 7: The Web of Accusations. Once the seed of witchcraft took root in the frozen soil of Salem, it spread with terrifying speed, like a venomous ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others who joined their ranks, like the influential Ann Putnam Jr., seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. Their fits became more dramatic, more public, and more convincing. They would convulse on the floor of the meeting house, scream out during prayers, and claim they could see the spectral forms of their tormentors hovering over certain villagers. This wasn't just childish fantasy. It was a horrifying public theater, and most disturbingly, it was believed. The first to be accused were women with no power, no allies, no one to speak for them. They were easy targets, women who already lived on the fringes of Puritan society. There was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar known for muttering to herself when people turned her away from their doorsteps. Villagers now claimed her muttering wasn't just aimless rambling, it was a curse. She smoked a pipe, she snapped at children, she fit the preconceived mold of a witch precisely because she failed to fit the mold of a proper Puritan woman. Then there was Sarah Osborne, a woman who had already scandalized the community. She hadn't attended church in over a year, and after her first husband died, she had committed the social sin of marrying her indentured servant, attempting to seize her son's inheritance for her new husband. A woman who defied social and religious convention was clearly suspect. And then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's own household. Originally from Barbados, her cultural background, her accent, and the stories of folklore she told the children were seen as exotic and frightening to the insulated villagers. Under immense pressure and likely physical coercion, Tituba did something that blew the crisis wide open. She confessed. But her confession did not bring relief. It brought terror. She wove a fantastical tale of a tall man in black, a figure everyone recognized as the devil who had asked her to sign his book. She described seeing strange animals, a yellow bird, a red cat, spectral dogs. But most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem working alongside her. That was all the validation the magistrates needed. Tituba's confession was the spark that lit the wildfire. If she was a witch and she wasn't working alone, then who else was hiding in their midst? New names were added to the list daily, then hourly. The crisis spiraled out of control. Neighbors turned on neighbors, using the accusations to settle old scores. Long-simmering property disputes were suddenly reframed as spectral assaults. If a man's cow suddenly fell ill and died, it must have been bewitched by the neighbor he'd argued with over a fence line. If a baby cried inconsolably during a prayer, surely that was the devil's work, brought on by the old woman who had glanced at it a moment before. The fear became so infectious, so overpowering, that even the rational and the innocent were paralyzed. To speak out in defense of an accused witch was to invite suspicion upon yourself. Were you perhaps one of them too? Silence became the only shield. And so, the web of accusations widened, its sticky, invisible threads trapping the entire village. Logic had evaporated. Hysteria was now in command. Chapter 8, The Court of Fear. As accusations mounted, and the small village of Salem descended into a fever pitch of paranoia, the colonial government was forced to step in. The newly appointed governor, William Phipps, eager to assert his authority and restore order, established a special court to handle the spiraling crisis. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a formal name derived from Old French law meaning to hear and to determine. But in practice, it became a factory for fear-driven justice, a place where condemnation was all but guaranteed. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules were warped by the panic gripping the colony. Instead of demanding hard, verifiable evidence, the court allowed something far more insidious and impossible to refute: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony from a victim claiming that the spirit, or specter, of the accused person had appeared to them and caused them harm. In other words, if one of the afflicted girls screamed that she saw your ghostly form choking her in a dream, that was considered admissible evidence in court. It didn't matter if you were miles away, or asleep in your bed, or even sitting in church at the time. Your spirit was believed to be doing the devil's work, independent of your body. How could anyone defend themselves against such a charge? You couldn't cross-examine a dream. You couldn't produce an alibi for your soul. You couldn't disprove it. The afflicted girls were now the star witnesses. Their seizures, their screams, and their gasps in the courtroom grew more theatrical and convincing by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into violent fits the moment a suspected witch was brought into the room. If the accused looked at her, she shrieked in agony. If they looked away, she shrieked even louder. These chilling performances mesmerized the courtroom, and the judges, including the influential Samuel Sewall and the unyielding Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all as proof of guilt. There were no defense lawyers. The concept simply didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood utterly alone before your accusers and your judges. The system was a cruel trap. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls would writhe in agony on the floor, seemingly proving your guilt. If you confessed to witchcraft, you might be spared execution, but only on one condition. You had to name other witches. The system didn't seek truth. It sought more names. It rewarded lies and punished integrity. Worse still, the trials became public spectacles. People traveled from neighboring towns to witness the drama unfold, packing the meeting house to watch their neighbors be condemned. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, often bewildered, impoverished, and almost always powerless against the machine that was grinding them down. And yet, not everyone was convinced. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking, that they were caught up in a dangerous game. Others began to question why so many of the accused were people who had disputes with the powerful Putnam family, whose daughter Anne was one of the lead accusers. But very few dared to speak these thoughts openly. In the atmosphere of Salem, questioning the court felt like questioning the will of God himself. Reason had been cast aside. The law had become a twisted mirror, reflecting not justice, but the deepest fears of a community that had lost its way. Chapter 9, Gallows Hill. On the 10th of June, 1692, the gallows on a barren, windswept patch of earth just outside Salem, known as Gallows Hill, claimed its first victim. Her name was Bridget Bishop. She was not a stranger to scandal, which made her an easy, predictable first target. She wore bright red clothing, an affront to Puritan modesty. She ran a tavern where people drank and played games, and she had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, though she was acquitted. During her trial, a parade of neighbors testified against her. They claimed her spirit pinched them in the night. They said their babies fell ill after she passed by their homes. They even claimed to have found enchanted poppets or dolls with pins in them hidden in the walls of her house. Bridget Bishop denied everything, her voice defiant to the very end. "I am as innocent as the child unborn," she declared. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to the gallows, the rope was pulled, and the crowd watched in silence. With that single, solemn execution, the machinery of death began to churn in earnest. The hangings that followed came with horrifying speed. On the 19th of July, 5 more women were executed together: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse. The case of Rebecca Nurse sent a particular shockwave of terror through the community. She was an elderly, pious woman, widely beloved and respected for her good standing in the church. She was the opposite of the stereotypical witch. The jury, in fact, initially found her not guilty, but the judges, under pressure from the public outcry and the renewed fits of the afflicted girls in the courtroom, forced the jury to reconsider. The verdict was reversed. As she stood on the gallows, Rebecca Nurse's final words whispered through the air like a prophecy. "I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency." But it didn't matter. The noose did not discriminate between the pious and the outcast. In August, more executions followed. Then came the 22nd of September, the deadliest day of the trials. 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a respectable church member who had made the fatal mistake of publicly doubting the girls' accusations early on. Her skepticism had sealed her fate. Her husband, Giles Corey, met an even more horrific end. An 81-year-old farmer known for his stubbornness, Giles refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty at his trial. By law, the court could not try him without a plea. So, they resorted to an ancient and brutal English punishment designed to force one, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. He was laid on the ground, a wooden board placed on his chest, and heavy stones were piled on top of him slowly, cruelly, over the course of 3 days. The magistrates repeatedly demanded his plea. His only response, as legend has it, was to gasp, "More weight." He died without ever entering a plea, a final, agonizing act of defiance. By the time the hysteria finally subsided, 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill. 1 man had been pressed to death. At least 5 more, including an infant, died in the squalid, freezing jails while awaiting trial. Dozens more confessed to crimes they did not commit just to save their own lives. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast a long, dark shadow over Salem, a shadow that stretched not just across the hill, but into every home and every heart. Fear had been codified as law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold. Chapter 10. The Turning of the Tide. By the autumn of 1692, the spell of hysteria that had held Salem in its grip for nearly a year finally began to crack. The change did not come from a sudden dawn of reason within the court, but because the accusations, in their frenzy, had finally grown too bold and flown too close to the Sunday. The fire of paranoia had begun to threaten the very people who had been warming their hands by its glow. A critical turning point came with the trial of Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister. He was accused of being the ringleader of the witches, a sort of diabolical puppet master. Burroughs was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with some of the powerful families in the village, making him a target. But on the day of his execution, as he stood on the gallows with the rope around his neck, Burroughs did something shocking. He flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer from beginning to end, something that, according to popular belief, a witch was incapable of doing. The crowd, which had gathered to see a devil condemned, fell silent. Some people began to weep. Even the most hardened observers were shaken. For a moment, it seemed the execution might be stopped, but the officials pushed forward, and Burroughs was hanged. Still, that moment planted a powerful seed of doubt in the public mind. Then, the accusers overplayed their hand completely. They began naming people who were simply untouchable, including the wife of the governor himself, Mary Phipps. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the very top of the colony's social and political ladder. Governor Phipps, who had already been growing unnerved by the increasing chaos and criticism from Boston's intellectual elite, finally took decisive action. In October 1692, he officially dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions and trials. Public sentiment had shifted. Influential ministers like Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, began to publicly denounce the court's reliance on spectral evidence. "It were better," Mather famously wrote, "that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." It was a radical idea in a society that had, for months, believed the exact opposite. The people who had once cheered at the trials now began to question them. The jails were still full of accused witches, but the public appetite for blood had finally been sated. Too many respected figures had been accused. Too many pious people had been buried. The villagers were beginning to see that this wasn't divine justice. It was a collective madness. Confessions dried up. Some of the accusers quietly backtracked their stories or disappeared from public view. The fear had not vanished, but it had exhausted itself. Salem, bruised, ashamed, and traumatized, was finally ready to wake up from its long nightmare. The storm was breaking. But the damage had already been done. Chapter 11. The Aftermath and the Echo. The gallows on the hill were silent. The jails slowly emptied. But Salem was a village that would never be at peace again. It wasn't haunted by the ghosts of witches, but by the ghost of its own guilt. What had started with a handful of sick girls in a minister's house had exploded into a communal act of self-destruction. Families had been torn apart, reputations had been systematically ruined, and innocent lives had been brought to a violent end. And now, the survivors had to live in the wreckage. Neighbors who had once prayed together could no longer look each other in the eye, knowing that one had testified against the other. Some of the afflicted girls, like Ann Putnam Jr., would later express public remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and offered a formal apology, blaming her actions on a great delusion of Satan. But for many, the damage was far beyond the repair of words. Remarkably, a few of the officials also admitted their wrongdoing. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, performed a stunning act of public penance. In 1697, he stood silently in his Boston church, while his minister read aloud his confession, in which he accepted the blame and shame for his role in the condemnation of the innocent and prayed for forgiveness. It was a rare and powerful moment of accountability in an era when most of those in power simply tried to forget. Forgetting, however, wasn't an option for the families of the condemned. They began a long, slow fight for justice. Over the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, demanding official pardons, the return of confiscated property, and a public acknowledgement that their loved ones were innocent. Slowly, grudgingly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some of the victims and offered a limited financial restitution to their heirs. The shame of the trials became a permanent part of the town's identity. The village of Salem eventually changed its name to Danvers in a symbolic attempt to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the very memory of what had happened there. But the memory persisted. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy echoes through American history, a chilling cautionary tale about how easily a society can lose its moral compass. It was a catastrophic breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners, simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts, meant to protect the innocent, became tools of oppression. Religion was weaponized, and silence was twisted into a confession of guilt. The phrase witch hunt has since become a political shorthand for any campaign of persecution or moral panic. But Salem was not a metaphor. It was a real town where real people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps its most lasting lesson is this: fear, when left unchecked and legitimized by power, can become its own form of tyranny. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom's quiet, but the warning of Salem still stands. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history has a terrifying habit of repeating itself, unless we remember. Music shifts again, becoming dramatic, classical, and intense, with a sense of political intrigue. Narrator. While Salem was a society torn apart by the fear of hidden power, we now travel back in time to an empire where power was anything but hidden. It was brandished like a sword, in the open, in the heart of the world's greatest city. Our next story is of a woman who was not afraid of power. She did not wait for it. She seized it with both hands in a world that forbade her from doing so. She was the first woman to wage war on Rome. Her name was Fulvia. Part 3. Fulvia, the woman who dared. Chapter 12. The forging of a rebel. In the heart of the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic was a pressure cooker, and it was about to explode. The old rules that had governed the empire for centuries were collapsing. Civil wars, populist revolts, and violent power struggles between titanic generals like Pompey and Julius Caesar were turning the marble streets of Rome into a battlefield. The Republic was unraveling, and into this maelstrom of chaos, a woman named Fulvia was born. Born around 83 BCE, she was a child of the elite, but not of the old patrician guard. The Fulvi were an old plebeian family that had clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics over generations. Their bloodline carried a potent mix of ambition and a taste for disruption. Her father was known more for a bumbling stammer than for any political prowess, but Fulvia, she was no stammerer. She was born to command. From her earliest years, Fulvia would have been immersed in the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals would have debated policy and plotted strategy in her own home. Elections, betrayals, and assassinations were the daily news. She would have seen with startling clarity that politics wasn't just played in the Grand Senate House, but in strategic marriages, in public funerals, in whispered rumors, and in bloody backroom deals. In this world, elite Roman women were expected to be quiet, refined, and obedient partners. Their influence was to be wielded from the shadows. Fulvia would shatter every one of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, fiercely intelligent, and politically connected, and she knew it. While her early life is hazy in the historical record, her later actions paint a portrait of a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly, absolutely unafraid. This was not a woman who would ever fade into the background. She possessed a will of iron, a sharp political mind, and an unnerving readiness to act, even in the exclusively male-dominated arena of Roman governance. Rather than recoil from the chaos that was tearing her world apart, Fulvia learned to use it. She learned to ride the storm. Her upbringing didn't produce the modest, demure matron that Rome idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 of the most powerful and radical men in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry power, she would command it. She would command armies, she would lead revolts, and she would become the first living Roman woman to have her face appear on a coin, not as a goddess, but as herself, a political force to be reckoned with. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was more than ready for Rome. Chapter 13. Marriages of Power. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but a conventional Roman union. Clodius was no ordinary nobleman. He was a political arsonist, a populist rabble-rouser with a genius for chaos, scandal, and mobilizing the power of the streets. To the Roman elite, he was a dangerous demagogue. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage united Fulvia's wealth and connections with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred female-only religious ceremony being held in Julius Caesar's own home, a scandal that only seemed to boost his popularity. Fulvia, far from being a passive background consort, was right there beside him, an active participant in his political world. Roman sources suggest she engaged with his supporters, was a visible presence during his campaigns, and helped manage their household as a bustling hub for his political operations. Together, they were a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But this life in the political firestorm came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way, ambushed by the bodyguards of a political rival. His death sent shockwaves through Rome, but Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly in the shadows. In a brilliant and shocking move, she staged a political funeral that became the stuff of legend. She had her husband's mutilated body paraded through the Roman Forum, his bloody wounds exposed for all to see. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. In a fit of populist fury, the mob used the Senate House itself as a funeral pyre, burning it to the ground. Fulvia had single-handedly turned her personal grief into a full-blown public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it demonstrated her genius for manipulating public emotion and using spectacle as a weapon. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of his shadow. Rome would never see her the same way again. She didn't wait long. Shortly after, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and a passionate supporter of Julius Caesar. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated alliance. Through Curio, Fulvia attached herself to the next great power block in Rome, the Caesarians. But once again, tragedy struck. The Republic finally collapsed into open civil war between Caesar and Pompey. Curio, fighting for Caesar, was sent on a military expedition to Africa, where he was ambushed and killed. Once again, Fulvia was a widow. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's brutal political violence, both of whom had died fighting for populist causes. A lesser woman would have retreated, but Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter was still to come. Her third and final marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious, charismatic general and loyal right-hand man of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged around 47 BCE, was not a marriage. It was a merger of power. Fulvia brought her mastery of Roman street politics and her vast network of supporters. Antony brought his military might and his connection to Caesar. Together, they formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic. Antony, for all his bravado, understood Fulvia's value. He allowed her to exercise an authority that no Roman woman had ever publicly wielded before. She opened his official correspondence. She issued orders in his name when he was away on campaign. She sat in on political meetings and influenced military appointments. The Roman historians of the time, almost all of them hostile to her, depicted her as overbearing and power-hungry. But what truly disturbed them wasn't her ambition. It was that she was acting like a Roman man, in a world that had no language for such a woman. Chapter 14, The Queen of Rome. After Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. As Mark Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, it was Fulvia who held the city of Rome itself. While Antony was off forming the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his regent in the capital, in all but name. In this period of extreme violence and instability, Fulvia proved she could play the game as ruthlessly as any man in the Senate. She directed Antony's allies, she dealt with the volatile urban masses, and she waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops with her own fortune, she offered bribes to maintain public order, and she ensured that any legislation passed in the Senate favored Antony's future. She made public appearances, she maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic, and she met with centurions, reminding them that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards. Her power became so undeniable that Roman coins were minted bearing not only Antony's image, but her name as well, an unprecedented public acknowledgement of her status. She wasn't hiding in the shadows of power. She was standing in its full, blinding glare. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. The Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian Caesar's young, cunning heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, despised Fulvia's influence. They saw her as a meddling, dangerous woman with far too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Fulvia knew the fragile alliance between Antony and Octavian was cracking. She could see that the Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So, she began to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now, she was ready to take it into her own hands. Chapter 15. The Unthinkable War. In the year 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against a Roman triumvir. She went to war against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. And she did not do it quietly. With her husband Mark Antony still stationed in the east, entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt, Fulvia and Antony's younger brother, Lucius, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The official reason was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of his veterans, who were being displaced by Octavian's policies. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion, orchestrated and led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history such a thing would happen. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources claim she was even more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, she stirred public opinion, she corresponded with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions and issuing military orders. With Lucius acting as her political frontman, they raised 8 legions and seized the strategic city of Perusia. Octavian, though initially surprised, acted with swift and brutal efficiency. He laid siege to Perusia through the harsh winter, cutting off all supplies and hammering the city into submission. Inside the walls, Fulvia, trapped between dwindling food supplies and political betrayal, watched her bold and desperate gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, the starving city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely a political gesture by Octavian to avoid completely alienating Antony. But Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, and armies was now deemed too dangerous to remain on Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon, a city in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony did not come running. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had been eroded by distance and political maneuvering. Fulvia had acted in his name, perhaps, but without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had ever done before, and now the Republic had made her pay the price. Chapter 16. Erasure and Legacy. Banished from Rome, her health failing, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE. Likely from a combination of illness, stress, and heartbreak. She was only around 43 years old. Her death was politically convenient. Mark Antony used it as a clean slate. Shortly after she was gone, he met with Octavian and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirs were united once more, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, was gone. In the aftermath, the men she had once maneuvered began the quiet, deliberate work of rewriting her legacy. She was posthumously scapegoated. The ancient historians, writing from the perspective of her enemies, painted her as the sole reason for the Civil War. They depicted her as a jealous, overbearing shrew, driven by an unnatural lust for power. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had operated in a political climate where violence and manipulation were the tools of the trade, at least, if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would ultimately prove to be. Her only true crime was her gender. She was a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome did not know how to process that. She wasn't cloistered in the home, weaving quietly. She was writing letters to generals, organizing street mobs, and commanding the loyalty of troops. And that made her dangerous, not just to her enemies, but to history itself. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no grand funeral, just a deafening silence. And yet, they couldn't erase her entirely. She was the first Roman woman to have her name minted on a coin, a political agent in her own right. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia's defiance still echoes. She didn't just live in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, she left her fingerprints all over its collapse. She was not a footnote in history, she was a force. Music shifts a final time, becoming soulful, hopeful, and filled with the sounds of gospel and folk music. Narrator: Fulvia fought for power in a dying republic. 2,000 years later, on the soil of a new republic, another monumental struggle would unfold. This was not a fight for the power to rule, but for the simple, profound right to be treated as human. We travel now to a sweltering summer day in America, a day when 250,000 people gathered to demand the soul of their nation live up to its promise. We are going to the March on Washington, Part 4, The Dream of a Nation. Chapter 17, A Nation on the Brink. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country at war with itself, a nation teetering between two irreconcilable worlds. One was a world rooted in centuries of brutal oppression, and the other was a world aching, desperately, to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social custom, it was the law, enforced with violence and terror. Black Americans were systematically barred from restaurants, from schools, from buses, from voting booths, and even from public drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant and went unpunished. Lynchings still occurred in the shadows of the rural South. And in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters, including children, were being met with snarling police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses that could tear the bark from a tree. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission anymore. The civil rights movement had surged into the national consciousness. Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, freedom rides on interstate buses, and economic boycotts had become familiar, powerful headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and a young John Lewis were no longer just names. They were symbols of a defiant, unbreakable courage. The March on Washington was not born from a single idea, but from a rising tide of frustration and a fierce, unyielding hope. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting for gradual change. They were demanding their full civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard in the one place that could not ignore them: the nation's capital. The idea itself had been circulating for decades. Philip Randolph, a revered labor organizer, had first proposed a mass march back in the 1940 seconds to pressure the Roosevelt administration into desegregating the defense industry. That march was called off when Roosevelt conceded, but now, in 1963, the stakes were infinitely higher. Randolph, along with other key leaders like the brilliant strategist Bayard Rustin and a charismatic young preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for an end to police brutality, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and most of all, for the basic human right to live free of fear. The countdown had begun. Across the country, in church basements and community centers, buses were being organized. Flyers were being printed. The word was spreading faster than any newspaper. From the cotton fields of Mississippi to the steel mills of Pittsburgh, a people were preparing to move. They were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable and transformative moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time. Chapter 18, The Architect of the Dream. Pulling off a protest for over 100,000 people in the heart of the nation's capital sounded like madness. The logistics were a nightmare. Food, water, transportation for tens of thousands, sound systems, thousands of portable toilets, medical teams, city permits, crowd control, and yet, somehow, in just 8 short weeks, they made it happen. At the absolute center of this controlled chaos stood one man, Bayard Rustin. Rustin was a master strategist, a political genius who for years had been kept behind the scenes for political reasons. He was openly gay, and in the 1960 seconds, that made him a target. He was also a former communist. His identity was seen as a liability that could be used to discredit the entire movement. But his brilliance was undeniable. Rustin had studied nonviolence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had been jailed, beaten, and constantly surveilled by the FBI. But nothing fazed him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to demonstrate to the world the incredible power of disciplined, nonviolent protest, coordinated with military precision. His plan was a masterpiece of organization. Every bus and train heading to Washington was tracked. Every speaker was timed down to the minute. Every route had volunteer marshals trained in nonviolent crowd control. They even prepared tens of thousands of cheese sandwiches. They weren't just planning a march, they were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. Meanwhile, the Kennedy administration watched with deep anxiety. They feared riots, backlash from segregationists, or worse, bloodshed. The National Guard was placed on standby. Hospitals in D.C. were put on alert. Liquor sales were banned for the day. But the civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. There was also friction within the movement itself. The Big Six civil rights organizations often clashed over tactics. The young firebrands of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were growing impatient with Dr. King's insistence on moderation. But for this one day, they all agreed to put their differences aside. The time for silence had passed. Chapter 19, The Rising Tide, the 28th of August, 1963. A sweltering, humid Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already beating down by 9 amperes, but it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country, they came, by bus, by train, by carpool, and some had even walked for days. Over 250,000 people in total, 250,000 souls, converging on the National Mall like a great rising tide of hope. They were black, they were white, young and old, students and teachers, factory workers and farmers. Some wore their Sunday best, suits and dresses, as if attending the most important church service of their lives. Others clutched handmade protest signs with simple, powerful demands: jobs and freedom, end segregated rules in public schools. Despite the government's fears, there was no chaos. The scene was astonishingly peaceful, suffused with a sense of shared purpose and quiet dignity. Volunteers handed out water. Groups spontaneously broke into singing freedom songs. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool, their voices echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. For many Black Americans, simply standing there, on that grass, in front of the monument to the great emancipator, felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to declare, we are here, in the very heart of the nation that had for so long tried to render them invisible. As the hours passed, the formal program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, their voices ringing out across the massive crowd. They demanded an end to police brutality, a fair living wage, and the passage of meaningful civil rights legislation. The great Mahalia Jackson sang, her voice soaring into the humid air. Marian Anderson, the legendary contralto who had once been banned from singing at a nearby concert hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky. But as the afternoon wore on, a palpable sense of anticipation grew. The crowd had grown quiet, not out of fatigue, but because they knew what was coming. The final speaker of the day had not yet taken the stage, and when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember forever. The march wasn't just making history, it was becoming legend, minute by minute. Chapter 20, The Dream. Standing in the long shadow of Abraham Lincoln, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He carried a set of prepared remarks, typed and carefully written the night before. He began with a measured, somber intensity, outlining the grim reality of a century of broken promises since the Emancipation Proclamation. 100 years later, he declared, his voice resonating across the mall, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell with the powerful cadence of a Baptist preacher, each phrase building on the last. The crowd listened in rapt attention. 250,000 people held in a state of suspended silence. But then, something shifted. something unplanned. Standing just behind him, the gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier, suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin! Tell them about the dream!" And in that moment, Dr. King did something extraordinary. He pushed his prepared notes aside, he gripped the podium, and he began to preach. He launched into a passage he had used before in other sermons, but never like this, never with this power, never in this place. "I have a dream," he said, and a roar went up from the crowd. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." His voice grew stronger, more impassioned, more prophetic with each repetition. "I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today." It was no longer a speech. It was a vision. It was a prayer. It was a lightning bolt through the heart of American history. By the time he reached his thunderous conclusion, quoting the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. There were tears, there were shouts of joy. There was a profound, overwhelming sense that they had just witnessed something more than oratory. They had heard prophecy. Chapter 21, The Unfinished Legacy. The March on Washington didn't produce immediate legislative miracles. President Kennedy, while impressed, still faced a Congress determined to block his civil rights bill. And just weeks later, the horrifying reality of hate struck again when 4 young black girls were murdered in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, but the nightmare was far from over. And yet, something had irrevocably changed. The march created an unstoppable moral momentum. Less than a year later, after Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson, leveraging the power of that moment and the memory of the fallen president, signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. The following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, striking down the Jim Crow laws that had disenfranchised black voters for generations. Would these laws have passed without the march? Possibly. But they would not have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure behind them. More than 60 years have now passed since that sweltering August afternoon. Dr. King's speech is taught in every school. His memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from Lincoln's. The legal framework of segregation has been dismantled. We have seen black lawmakers, judges, and even a 2-term U.S. president achievements that were unthinkable in 1963. And yet, the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by the poetry of the dream, still echo, largely unresolved. The call for a living wage remains unmet. Deep racial disparities in education, housing, and the justice system persist. Police brutality continues to ignite outrage and protest across the nation. The March on Washington was never meant to be a conclusion. It was a flashpoint. It was a declaration of intent, not a declaration of victory. And so the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether that dream is ultimately deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the giants of the past, but on us. On the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again until that dream becomes a shared, lived reality for all.